Hi everyone, this is Dawn. I'm so happy you could stop by today. Today I'm going to be making 2 cards using mostly Altenew products. So let's get started on the first card. I will be using the Altenew Leaf Burst Stencil, the Altenew Scripty Word Die, and the Tim Holtz Distress Texture Paste. The texture paste will give a really cool effect on the cards as well as give it a great dimensional feel. You will need some kind of palette knife to spread the texture paste on the stencil. I also like to use a stencil pal, but it's not necessary if you don't want to use one. I just find that it helps to smooth out any bumps. To start, I'm going to spray some Pixie spray on the back of the stencil. This really helps to hold the stencil in place so it doesn't move around while I'm putting the texture paste on. I let the Pixie spray dry for about a minute, then I line up my stencil where I want it to go. Then I'm going to spread the texture paste evenly on the top of the stencil. Don't be afraid to use a lot of texture paste because when you're all done, you can just scrape off any extra paste and put it back in the jar. You can spread the paste out however you would like to. You can make the layer as thick or thin as you want, depending on how much texture you would like on the card. When I'm done, I just scrape the extra right back in the jar. Here I'm using my stencil pal to just smooth out the texture paste. When I'm done, I very gently pull the stencil off and set it aside to dry. Once you are done, you need to wash the stencil off so the paste doesn't dry on the stencil. I just keep a bowl on my desk with soapy water in it and put it in there until I have time to wash it. This is the second card I will be making. I decided to put the paste on now to give it some time to dry. Here I'll be using the Altenew Feeling Dotty stencil. I did spray some Pixie spray on the back of the stencil off screen. When the spray has dried, I lined up the stencil on my paper. Again, I spread the texture paste on the stencil with my palette knife. When I'm done, I scrape the extra back in the jar. Here I'm using my stencil pal again to just smooth it out. When I'm done, I very slowly take off the stencil and set the paper aside to dry. Then I place the stencil in some soapy water. Now that I did both the texture paste, I'm going to go back to my first card. I'm going to die cut the hug sediment using the Altenew Scripty Word Dies. I'm going to place it onto Hero Art's pitch black cardstock. I will then place it on my die cutting machine. Today I'm using the Gemini Junior. It is one of my favorite die cutting machines, but you can use any die cutting machine you have. I like dimension on my cards, so I'm going to die cut 3 of them. Once I have all 3, I'm going to glue them together using my Gina Connect glue. I really like using the Gina Connect glue for intricate dies. I feel like it doesn't dry too fast, so it gives you a little wiggle room to get the words lined up correctly. I like using my art glitter glue when I have to glue a lot of things. You will see me using that coming up shortly. When I'm all done, I will then set these aside. Now that the texture paste has dried, I will then spray the back of the stencil with Pixie spray again. Then I'm going to line it back up on the cardstock where it was before. I'm going to use my purple tape to adhere the stencil down this time so it doesn't move around at all. Next, I'm going to be using my Altenew inks to color the texture paste. I'm using my Picket blending brush. I find that I like the blending brushes because they don't leave harsh lines on my paper. First, I'm going to start with my darkest color, the Galactic stream, going in a circular motion in the middle of the card. Then I'm going to bring in Teal Cave, continuing in my circular pattern, making the circles bigger as I go around the card. The next color I will use is Aqualicious, each time starting over in the middle of the card, so the middle keeps getting darker as I go. Once I've covered most of the texture paste, I'm going to come in with the lightest color, Dewdrops, covering all around the outer edge of the card. I like the Altenew ink products because they take the guesswork out of what colors work best together, but you can use any ink that you have. Once I'm done, I will slowly take off the stencil. Now I'm going to set that aside. Now I'm going to cut a piece of Gina K Turquoise Sea cardstock to 4 inches by 5 1/4 inches. Then I'm going to trim the leaf burst panel to 3 3/7 by 5 1/16 inches. It is very important to cut off equal portions from each side of the paper so that the flower burst stays evenly in the center of the paper. Believe me, I've made this mistake before, so it's easy to forget to do this. Once I'm done, I'm going to cut a piece of craft foam to 3 3/4 by 5 inches. This is just slightly smaller than the leaf burst panel. When I add this to the card, it will give it a nice raised dimension. Now I will use my art glitter glue to adhere the craft foam to the back of the card. I didn't show it here, but I did first glue the craft foam to the back of the card. I must have edited it out of the video by mistake, so you don't actually see me adhere it to the back of the panel, so I'm sorry about that. Then I will glue the leaf burst panel to the turquoise cardstock. This glue is great to use when you have a lot of area to glue. I find that it's very cost effective, but you can use any glue that you have. Next, I'm going to use the Hero Arts Everyday Sayings Sending Warm Fuzzy stamp. However, I do not want to use the fuzzy part of the stamp, so I cut that part off. This way, I can just use the Sending Warm part of the stamp. I'm going to use the MISTI stamping tool. This makes stamping everything so much easier for me, especially if I have to double stamp something, but you can use an acrylic block as well. I use my anti-static powder. You need to use this before you heat emboss so that the embossing powder only goes where you want it to. Then I use my black VersaFine ink to stamp. This ink stays wet longer, making it easier to emboss with. Once I do that, I will use Ranger Clear Embossing Powder to cover the sentiment. Then I shake any excess off back into the container. I will then heat the embossing sentiment using my heat gun. Make sure that the heat gun is nice and hot. It helps to prevent the card from warping. I did use my favorite thing, sentiment strip die cut here. However, it is discontinued. I did link below in the description a different sentiment strip die I have that you can use in place of this. Now I'm going to assemble the card. I have a piece of Nina Classic Crest 110 pound cardstock that I folded to 5 1/2 by 4 1/4 inches. I will then take the leaf burst panel and adhere it to the top of the cardstock using my liquid glue, but you can use any tape runner if you choose. Then I lay out where I want the sentiments to go on my card. Once I figure that out, I will then take a small piece of craft foam that I cut to the same size as the sentiment strip, and I will attach it to the back of the Sending Warm sentiment. I feel like this gives more dimension to the sentiment, which I think adds a nice look to the card. Then I will add glue to the back of the hug sentiment and adhere both sentiments to the card. Once I am done, I will adhere gems all over the card. I like to use my Pink Fresh Studio gems. They come in such a great variety pack of all different colors, and there are 3 different sizes in each container. I'm using the 2 smallest sizes of the turquoise color on the first card. First, I lay them out where I want them to go on the card. By the way, sorry if my head keeps getting in the way every now and then. I didn't realize it when I was shooting the video. Okay, so now I use my jewel picker to help pick them up so I can glue them on my card much faster. I will continue to go around the card until all the gems are glued down. Once I've glued all the gems in place, I will use my Nouveau Crystal Clear glaze to put on the hug sentiment. When this dries, it will give it a really nice shiny look. It does take about, quite a few hours, maybe 8 hours for it to totally dry. So that completes our first card. Now let's move on to our second card. Now that the distress paste is dry, I'm going to spray Pixie spray on the back of the stencil. I did this off screen. When it dries, I line it back up on the stencil, making sure to line it up exactly where it was before so the ink doesn't bleed through the holes. Then I'm going to use my purple tape to hold it down so it doesn't move at all because I only want the color on the top of the dots. When I have the stencil where I want it, I use my blending brush to put a very light layer over the stencil. I'm using my Altenew inks again. I chose to use the same color combination I used for the first card. I'm using the lightest color called Dewdrops for this layer. I'm very gently rubbing it on the stencil because I just want a very faint color. When I'm done, I pull off the stencil, and as you can see, it gives it a nice soft look. I'm then going to trim the panel down to 3 7/8 by 5 1/8 and set the card aside for later when I assemble the card. I will then take a piece of white cardstock and trim it down to 2 3/4 by 5 1/8. I will use this to layer on top of the dotted panel. Next, I will use Paper Smooches Dots and Dashes die set. I'm going to use the dashes for this particular card. I line the die right along the edge of the paper. I will tape it down and die cut it in my die cutting machine. I will do the same for the other side and then set it aside. Now I'm going to stamp the flowers in my MISTI stamping tool. I'm using the Altenew Bloom and Bud stamp set. This is a beautiful stamp set that layers up very easily, especially if you use the MISTI stamping tool. However, you can use acrylic blocks if you want to. I put the most solid layer down first on my paper and close the MISTI on it. I make sure my paper is lined up right against the edge of the MISTI, otherwise future images will not line up. You will see what I'm talking about shortly. I use my lightest color ink first to stamp the image. Then I decided I wanted the image to be a little darker, so I double stamped it. You do not need to do this if you do not want to. Then I rotate my paper and push it right up to the edge of the MISTI again. You can quickly and easily create many images with the MISTI. I ink up my stamp again and close the MISTI, making sure to press down to get a really good image. As you can see, I keep making sure the paper is pushed up against the edge of the MISTI. Sometimes the stamps are very sticky, and even with a magnet, the paper will still shift. I come in with my second image. It's very easy to see how the image lines up. I'm putting down an extra magnet because the stamp is very sticky and I don't want my paper to move. I'm then coming in with my next color, which is Aqualicious, and I'm stamping it over the solid image. Make sure to press down on the stamp to give it a nice crisp image. I did decide to double stamp it because I'm going for a very vibrant look on my flower. Now I rotate my paper, and here is where I forgot to push my paper up against the edge of the MISTI. You can see the space off to the right hand side, and you can see how it's stamped off center, but that's okay. I was just making an extra flower to have, but I will not be using it for this card. Now I'm on to the third image, and again it's very easy to line up. There are a few different spots that you can easily match up for this image. I'm using my next color called Teal Cave to stamp this image. I'm only stamping this image once since the ink is much darker, so you do not need to double stamp this. I bring in my final stamp. Again, it lines up very easily. There is a point right here where my finger is, and you line that up on the stamped image as you could see me doing in the picture. Once I line it up, I bring in my last color, Galactic Stream. This is the darkest color out of all of them. I only stamped this one time. I felt like it was dark enough. Now that the flower is stamped, we have to stamp the center of the flower. This has two stamps. I line it up right in the middle of the flower. I stamp the solid layer first with Mango Smoothie. Then I bring in the next image. I line it up and I stamp it with the same Mango Smoothie, but to make it look like I used two different colors, I will double stamp it. This will make the image appear to have been stamped with two different colors, when in fact I only used one. When I'm done, I place it aside, and now I'm going to stamp the bud images. I will go through the same process as the first set of stamps. I line up the solid image first. Remember to always make sure the paper is pushed up against the edge of the MISTI so your stamps line up properly. I will stamp the first image with my lightest colored dewdrops. Then I will rotate the card and stamp the image again. This time I decided to stamp the image only one time. I then come in with my second stamp. This stamp is also very easy to line up. I will use the Aqualicious ink to stamp this image. I did decide to double stamp this image to give it a darker and more solid look. When I'm done, I rotate my paper and stamp this image twice, making sure in between stamping to push my paper up against the edge of the MISTI. I then come in with my third stamp. This stamp lines up pretty easily, matching the bottom of the stamp to the bottom of the stamped image. I then stamp it with my Teal Cave ink, making sure to press down on the image when I stamp it to give it a nice even impression, because I'm only going to stamp this once. I will then rotate my paper and repeat the process for this image. Finally, I will bring in the last stamp. This lines up just as easy. I slowed down the process so you can see how it lines up. There are points that make it easy to line up. Then I close my MISTI. I will then ink up the stamp with my darkest ink called Galactic Stream. I then rotate the paper and I stamp the next bud, making sure to press down to get a good impression. Now I will bring in the stem for the bud. This is fairly easy to line up. Make sure it is lined up exactly where it needs to be, or when you go to die cut the bud, the die won't fit properly. Then I will bring in some of the little leaves. I can use these to decorate around the big bloom flower. Once everything is lined up, I will then ink everything using my lightest color ink called Frayed leaf. Make sure to press down to get a good impression. I did decide to double stamp the leaves. I will then rotate the paper and I will continue the process to stamp the other bud and some more leaves. I double stamp the images twice. Now I bring in the second layer of the leaves, making sure to line them up directly on top of the other stamped image. I will then ink them up using a darker ink called Forest Glades. I only stamp this once and then I rotate my paper and I stamp the remaining images. Next, I bring in the last layer of the leaves, making sure to line them up properly. I stamp them again with my darkest ink, Forest Glades. Then I rotate the paper and continue the process for the remainder of the leaves. Next, I'm going to die cut all the flowers out using the matching die set. If you do not have the die set for this stamp set, you can easily fussy cut these flowers out. So I line up the dies on the top of the stamped images and I use my purple tape to hold them in place. Otherwise, I find that they shift around when I'm die cutting them. I pop all the pieces out and proceed to die cut all the rest of the images. Here I'm using the Altenew Handwritten Hello die. I will cut 3 of the Hello dies from the Gina K slate paper and the shadow die from the white paper. Then I will use my Gina K Connect glue to adhere all 3 of the slate Hello sentiments together. I like to use the Gina K Connect glue for intricate dies especially. It doesn't dry as fast and it gives you time to line the sentiments up properly. I love how intricate this handwritten sentiment is and that it comes with a shadow die. It looks absolutely beautiful on cards. Now I'm going to assemble the card. First, I had cut a piece of craft foam to 3 3/4 by 5 inches off screen. Then I'm going to adhere it to the back of the Feeling Dotty panel. As you can see, I switched back to using my art glitter glue, and I just noticed I have a piece of craft foam stuck to the bottom of the bottle. I have to remember to take that off. Once I'm done adhering the craft foam to the dotted panel, I'm going to adhere my white card panel to the front of the card. I just love how this card ends up having so much dimension to it by the time I'm done. I love dimension on my cards. Now I'm going to adhere my card front to the base of my card, and then I can start assembling the flowers onto the card. I'm going to lay out my flowers where I want them on my card. Once I have them in the right spot, I will then glue each flower to the card. I will use just glue to adhere the leaves to the card, but for the buds of the flowers, I'm going to use some foam tape to give them some dimension. I like to put a little glue on the foam tape in case I need to move them around a little bit. Make sure to add glue to the stem as well. I continue to put foam tape on the backs of all the flowers until each one is glued down. Then I will adhere the Hello sentiment to the card. When I'm done adhering the sentiment, I realized that the card looked like it needed something else, so I decided to go back and add another leaf to the card in the bottom left-hand corner. Once my card is assembled, I will then use clear crystal Nuvo drops. I will put it all over the Hello sentiment. I really love the shiny look it gives. I also feel like it gives a really great dimensional feel to the card. Then lastly, I'm going to adhere Studio Katia clear drops to the card. I originally wasn't adding gems, but then I decided to go back and add them, so I already laid them out on the card where I wanted them to go. I just glue them down, and that's it. That's my 2 cards. Thanks so much for stopping by, and hope you have a wonderful day and can stop by for my next video.